This episode of Zero Cafe is made possible by our partners Online Influence Institute, VWO and Content Square. Today I talk with Brian Kugelman, Senior Behavioral Scientist at Alter Spark. Brian started with behavioral science and technology in 1997, applied this at the United Nations for 7 years, did a PhD on trusted credibility for a year, and then for 2 years on behavioral change taxonomies. And you may know him from his course on digital psychology and behavioral design at CXL. In our talk today, there's going to be a lot of science. We're going to talk about behavioral principles, where these theories come from, and how we as zero specialists often apply them in a wrong way. And Brian is going to show us how to better ourselves. In case you missed the previous episodes, last time I spoke with Eltina van der Veer about why humanizing data is so important, and you can listen to that episode on www.zero.cafe or in the podcast app you're listening with right now. Welcome to Season 3, Episode 4.
Blast off!
Blast off! Here we go. Brian, welcome to the Zero Cafe podcast. And of course, we need to establish your authority. That's where we need to start, right? Why are we listening to you? So some people might know you from Twitter, your CXL courses, your articles. But for those who don't, can you please tell us a bit about your background and what you're doing in your daily life?
Sure, and also thanks a lot for having me here, Guido. This is awesome. So here's my authority pitch. So for me, I'm a specialist in using behavioral science and psychology, and I temper a little bit with neuroscience. And my shtick is looking at how this operates in a digital mediated environment. So that means in websites and mobile phones and tech. And actually, my background was in social change. So before I got into pure, like online change, it was all about changing population level health, but using technology for that purpose. And then later on, my career got a little bit more interface focused, so getting more to like the UX and the front end design. And one thing I could add is I'm not just an academic ivory tower theoretician. I work hands-on. So actually, I worked for many years in tech. I was a network admin at one point in my career. I program in PHP, Python. I build all the technologies. I do all my ads. I work frontline. So I actually do all implementation. So I'm not like, a high-level theoretical person. Well, actually, technically I am, and I have the scientific papers to back it. But if I don't get my hands dirty, I don't feel like I'm learning. So I make sure I'm up with the latest stuff. My next life, I'll be a developer, actually.
How do you go about mixing those two? Is it so completely split? You spend 2.5 days of the week on theory, 2.5 days a week on practice, or how does that work?
Yeah, it can be a little tough. So maybe I could tell you about that in my career, because also I get approached by a lot of people who want to work in areas sort of similar to where I operate. And it's an intersection between psychology and tech, right? It's like an overlap. So in my career, I'm a creative person and I have a lot of ideas. So I always push my bosses and I was throwing forward ideas so I could somehow get that integration. So I always found jobs where I was working in the two. So some jobs were more like pure technology, and I was never fully satisfied with those. And then some were like pure behavioral science. So I was working in crime prevention for the federal government of Canada. And I couldn't get my team to do anything digital. And eventually it was like, this is taking me off. So pure behavioral science was not fulfilling. And most of my career has been about the two. So I led a career like this. So that means you work not just with the implementation, but the strategy as well. So the psychology gives you the insight and the strategy and gives you the wisdom in how you implement. And the technology is about mastering your medium. So, whatever, Jimi Hendrix is a master at playing guitar, Rembrandt's, master at painting, ABBA masters at singing. So each masters at different crafts. So for me, the tech is like, you would have strategic insight with no ability to implement. right? If you only had the tech, and if you only had the strategy, it would all be theory with no ability to, implement. So you need both.
Yeah. And I think when a lot of people listening to that podcast, theories are mentioned quite often. We often talk about it's either BJ Fogg or Cialdini, of course. There's this whole list of behavioral economics. Kahneman, of course, is what we talk about. We have this amazing list of a couple of hundred cognitive biases on Wikipedia. What's your view on these? How do these all relate, and how do you work with them? Do you work with them?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So those are popular theoretical frameworks and models, and so um, uh, the way you work with a theory is, you have to understand its assumptions and background, and what a lot of people don't understand, and they sort of get pushed around like someone who's not really street smart and hasn't been around the block, is they tend to buy into some of the dogma and a lot of the assumptions. But when you work as an academic in behavioral science, you say, oh, it's just that theory, and that theory has these assumptions, and it was designed for these applications, and normally it has these principles that are its building blocks. And there's a lot of other backgrounds. So you approach them as different frameworks that generally serve a purpose in a different area of applied psychology. So Cialdini developed a system that was for sales psychology. What people don't know about Cialdini is, I understand in his doctorate, he sort of went undercover with what we would probably call today very sleazy sales strategies, like doing like used car style and like high pressure telephone sales, like stuff that you might have a moral conundrum with if you're working, or you'll have very good defense mechanisms if you don't like cognitive dissonance. And you're crossing some of those ethical lines, but that's where he did his research, and he distilled principles. So Cialdini developed a system that was basically structured around that one application. But you would never ever dream of using Cialdini's framework to build a health behavior change app, right? Like, it's great for conversion optimization because it comes from studying the psychology of sales, but it did not come from therapy, right? And then BJ Fogg's model is like a bit more of he has a bunch of models, right? So it depends on what model. But let's say the Fogg model, because that's what most people are talking about. So with his easy and ability framework. So BJ actually, he's an interesting player in the behavior change space, because I was actually at a series of conferences, and I felt like he was playing one on us. So BJ was trying to climatize a lot of people in the persuasive technology academic community, which is actually a very small community of scientists. I think he tried to get us on behaviorism. Like, I remember when he confessed he was a behaviorist, and it was like a crime. He was like coming out and admitting, I'm a behaviorist. So he really brought behaviorism back into the fold because it was very unpopular. And he distilled very basic principles that are required for almost all behavior change. So his framework is a very broad one. So basically, I would say violate BJ Fogg's principles at your peril. It's a general set of principles that apply to most situations. It gets into the core of how, like, our dopamine circuits and how reinforcement learning operates, right? This is how humans, insects, I believe plants as well, microorganisms, it's like how learning operates, right? Like, he's really distilled core principles, and his core principles are actually not his. You'll find his core principles in a number of other frameworks. But he put them together from a behaviorist perspective. So with his approach, it's sort of like pretty much standard practice. You should always be using it. Cialdini's got like the set of principles, and we could go on. There's a different story for each of the different frameworks.
For me, it also feels like the BJ Foggs are way more. Like I said, it's way more basic in how things function, how organisms function. Because when you look at the Cialdini ones, they are way more influenced also by by social changes. They're not so basic that they're not influenced by that. For example, social proof. Of course, when he was this pretending to be this sleazy car salesman, and doing this maybe in one-on-one situation. I mean, his book is from 1983, right? There was no online, but now when everyone's getting used to this, seeing 500 people reviewing a product very positively probably doesn't have the same effect anymore.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily believe it anymore. There's some skepticism that consumers now have.
Yeah. You can only use a persuasive design strategy for so long before everyone sort of figures out what's going on, and then they become street smart. I don't know if do you travel much? Or have you been to many parts
well,
of the
not in the last year, but before, yeah.
Yeah, so I traveled a lot. I filled up a number of passports to the point of having no pages left, and I backpacked for 10 months when I was 23 is when I did it.
Yeah.
So I went to a lot of like places that were like dangerous and new, and I remember the whole thing of being, they call it fresh off the boat. Like when you arrive, people try to exploit you because you don't know the games and the culture, right? And all the scammers are on you. And after a while, you get used to dealing with it, right? And you know how it works, but you don't know how the tactics operate and how the strategies operate until you've been there a while and you're a bit street smart. And I think it's the same with marketing tactics. So if you overdo a persuasive design strategy or behavior change principle, and we could get into how we even call these things or what we call them. But if you overdo them with an individual, they're going to know how it works, and that's going to lose its impact. If you poorly implement them, like say you overdo it, like Cialdini's principles are very effective. Like just because they came from like more aggressive sales strategies, there's nothing wrong with them. I think his principles are very high level and generally applicable. They're just not useful for everything. But if you overdo his principles, you will generally look like a sleazy hustler. And so you have to be a bit tasteful in how you implement. So it's like they say, what is a great work of art? It's like a great work of literature is a good story well told, right? So the story is like a generic plot narrative, and we humans have been saying the same stories so long. We don't get bored. We never get bored of those stories. They're wonderful, but we get bored of how those stories are expressed, and we always want to hear it retold from our generation's perspective. So how you take that principle and translate it, there's a lot in the implementation. So you can overdo a principle, and you can overexpose a population to a principle. And here's the dangerous thing. If a principle becomes associated with con artists and scammers, which I think many of the principles of psychology that are taught in CRO, they get adopted in that way because scammers say, hey, that's where all these people are doing it. And then these things get built into all the templates that are distributed. And so most of the really effective psychology-based principles have been mainstreamed into the design patterns that we all pull from. And then once they get into the hands of sleazy individuals, boom, you now start destroying them. And now what was a good social norm gets perceived as a threat or as a lie. And then good luck.
Yeah, and I think what you mentioned with travel, that's a great way. The further away you travel from where you're based and what's normal to you, the more basic you get with what works for you, and you get to see the world in a different way, and see, you have to revisit all these biases that you have, and figure out if they still work actually for you. I mean, a simple practical example is that part of the world drives on the left side of the road, part of the world drives on the right side of the road. It's not necessarily that one is better than the other, but it's just like a default that we've chosen to live with. And there are a lot of those, and you're probably not aware of most of them, at least not all the time, unless you start traveling, and then you figure out, hey, this is the way we do this is not normal. Let's. I need to recompose my brain to work in this new situation.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We habituate to things, so we get used to everything around us, and when something's very different, we don't know how to interpret, and it really stands out. And when it comes to design, I think also this impacts on like marketing and general communications for anyone in CRO, in that
Yeah.
um, basically if you're copying what everyone else is doing, and if there's a popular psychology book that has some strategies that says, oh, do this and that, and it's a magic psychological formula for getting higher conversions, right? Once everyone does it, it stops having impact. It's like an arms race, right? So that's now the
Yeah.
baseline, and people get used to it.
Yeah.
And then your messages start habituating like
Yeah.
crazy, or
And the danger is that you get habituated, you get used to those things really fast. I mean, if you could move to another country, day one, it might even be scary, but you're probably used to it after a week. And that's the same also true, I think, for as a CRO specialist, when working for a company, the first day you might still see all things wrong, but after a couple of weeks, you get used to, okay, we do this because it's easier for the back end. It's easier for for marketing to do it this way, because so we do it this way, and that's why I love doing user research. Actually, sitting next to people or watching people go through a website or using a product, because that brings you back in that state. It's a very similar experience to me than moving to for the first time to a new country and that first day, and then oh shit, why are we doing this? This is stupid. I didn't know, and people see this in a totally different way, and it opens your eyes and see your own product or website again through someone else's eyes.
oh yeah, I'm totally with you. Like we all become blind to our imperfections at some point.
Yeah,
Uh, and it's not until you look at things from the user's perspective that you can start saying, holy crap, like I don't do you ever like I'll sometimes when I have a problem on a page, I'll go and I'll watch a couple of click sessions and see what's going on. And a few times I was like, oh my God, did I design that? Right? Someone was on a mobile phone and then they reached a certain point in the process. I was like, oh my God, okay, now I know. Right? And you're like,
yeah,
bingo. Yeah. And you sometimes you won't even use software in ways that are like you can't conceive of how your users will use your software, right? They will do things in ways that are inconceivable, and only the user testing and getting in ethnographically behind them and seeing what they do, it's like the only way.
yeah. Especially, I mean, if you're designing something, you usually one of the default assumptions is, oh, okay, it's going to be on a website, or they're using a browser, and this is the only thing they're doing right now. And usually that's not the case. They have a couple of browsers open, they're looking on their mobile phone, they're stopping midway to get lunch, and that's usually not, and that's even hard to replicate in user studies, of course. But even without that, it's very eye-opening usually to do that. So I'm wondering, so when you start, or when you brought in for a new project, you have a very strong foundation on in both the theoretical part of the behavioral science and the practical part. When you start, do you start? I mean, I guess it's hard to completely keep them separate. But do you start thinking about, okay, start thinking about theoretical models and how can we solve that? How can we validate it with data? Or do you say, okay, we have this problem. Let's first look at the data and then see if we can find some theory that can help us out here?
Oh, I always start with reality before I even attempt to throw in anything theoretical. I mean, it also depends on costs as well, because sometimes if you scope out a project, it's like, and you agree we're going to use this tool for that problem, then, you sort of agreed to some degree on the model um,
Yeah.
already. And actually, maybe I could back up and introduce something more complex to the equation. So there's a researcher named Tetlock who looked at expert predictions, and he spent many years looking at experts and what they predicted. And Tetlock is probably the brother of Dunning-Kruger. I don't mean that. It's like the parallel to the psychology of naive optimism. So what he looked at is experts who make better and experts who make worse predictions. And he said, and this is one of the funny things. So the experts who make the worst predictions are the ones who are really confident. They sell you all black and white, this is how the world is, and they look at the world from a frame of reference, and they come with a sort of theoretical model that answers all the issues of reality, right, from their perspective. They're one view or one trick pony perspective on reality and how to frame everything. So they tend to have pretty crappy predictions, but they get most of the media attention. And when things don't work out, they tend to, I guess, develop skills in rationalizing things. The people who make the good predictions are those who look at the evidence and then play with a bunch of different models and say, well, it's sort of like this, but a bit like that. And, it will probably work out. I'm about 80% sure that this, and they come with more of these qualifications and they're more flexible. They tend to have more accurate predictions, but the media hates them. And I think those people, and I'm one of those, they tend to get, you don't do as well in your business for winning client jobs. You're not as strong a speaker because you're willing to look at reality and negotiate and be flexible. So it counts against you. And I think the market wants the one trick pony to come with the magic formula. So I am radically against that approach. So I look at the situation and then I come up with a model that is going to make sense in most cases. When I teach, obviously, I have to, I train people through models, but I don't train them to actually take anything off the shelf. I teach them to look at reality and then to compare models. And when you work for many years in behavioral science, there's no such thing as we apply Cialdini to everything, which is what a lot of people do. Or you mentioned hundreds of behavioral economics principles, right? Like there's these crazy lists, which I could get into later, why I think they're completely absurd and actually have no scientific merit, I believe. And I could get into that, why these over 100 lists of behavioral science principles are actually largely baseless. But you could come with all these tools, and then you could look at all the models, say the health belief model, the theory of reasoned action, the extended parallel process model. You could take BJ Fogg's model. You could take the trans-theoretical model, the theory of reasoned action and planned behavior. And I could go on. I could keep rattling off frameworks. But what you do is you have to pick the best model for the challenge. And in that, that's not even enough. Now you have to adapt that model, because the models require a little bit of calibration. And then what happens when you do that is if you fit a good model to a specific situation and it's really a good fit, then you set yourself up for better odds of success. But if you come with a prefixed model, you might be using the wrong tool for the job. I don't know, imagine someone comes in for medical care and the doctor just boom, gets penicillin or something, or
Yeah, exactly. But I do wonder. So I do feel sometimes like that person in the room that's everyone's making decisions or assumptions, and then you're the one saying, yeah, but well, not really. We can't really be sure, or have we validated this, or why on earth do you think it's like that? And I think I hear from multiple Zero people, they feel a bit the same, right? You're that person in the room that's, well, not necessarily negative Nancy, but you're the one being critical about all those things. And that's basically what you're saying, right? That's the more experience you have in this, the more uncertain actually you become. It's quite a humbling experience to see all your predictions fail all the time and do these experiments over and over and being confronted with being wrong. So what would be your advice for Zero people in handling this? How do you approach this? To not be seen as the negative Nancy or feel like a negative Nancy and be more, maybe more productive or more contributing to these situations?
I love that question, and I have never, I didn't expect you to ask that, and it's a wonderful one, because that's actually the reality of what most people who work in any sort of like applied psychology, whether it's more informal or more formal, you're going to face that once you're working with other people, right? You're asking for actual evidence, and then when you put forward, evidence-based design conventions and strategies, now you have the challenge of getting other people on board. And maybe I could start off with a bit of skepticism about human nature. So I think it's generally human nature to go towards conspiracy theories and utter nonsense and high status pride. Or sorry, high status backed arguments. So that means the highest paid person's opinion will generally outrank, even if what they say is of no merit. And whoever calls out the emperor for having no clothing, if they're low level in an institution, if it's a healthy institution, maybe they'll be listened to. In many cases, they'll be ignored, and in an unhealthy organization, you could get turned on for that. So it's always risky when you want to stand up for what you believe is right in the situation.
Yeah.
And maybe I could add one thing. So, I now have the credentials. I, got the PhD and the long career, and the big clients and all that. But I started in the trenches, working my way up, and I still, I sometimes like I work at a higher level, but I still have to, deal with the same things, right? I get people trust me more because I, spent my years and I can, normally rationalize my arguments for things, and explain them in a calm way that people understand. So, but I paid my dues when I was younger. I had a lot of all my ideas rejected. When I worked in the United Nations, I actually did a television commercial with Kofi Annan, who had just won the Nobel Peace Prize, right? And I was the one ultimately overseeing a TV commercial we put out. And my boss did not want me to pilot test it. And I was like, we're putting out a TV commercial. We're the United Nations. This thing is going to get played, right? We should maybe market test it. And my boss was hostile. He was against it. He was like, BS, and just whatever, get it out. I was like, so me and my friends came up with this crazy idea, and because we're the UN and we're doing this public service announcement commercial that was going to go around the world. We translated it into it was like English, Spanish, French, Arabic, Chinese, and Russian because we're the UN. Those are the official languages. I'm not allowed to pilot test it. We didn't know some of the creative in it. We didn't know how it would do. So me and my colleagues, we came up with this scheme to run a secret lunch session where we got people who represented all the cultures of the world. So we got some of our colleagues from Latin America, some North Americans, some Europeans, Africans, Asians, right? We tried to be representative. So I created a representative, like a cluster sample focus group. And then we did a secret lunch pilot test on this. I got the data to this day. It was the funniest thing. So I started in behavioral science early. I started in 1997, right? So this is pretty early, and I was using tech then. So I was undercover. Now there's an appetite, but I actually operated in hostile environments where I could come out on my performance evaluation for having dared, done pilot testing and validation of creative. So this is totally
so basically the advice for CROs that find themselves in this situation is one, build on your authority, and two, build a secret life where you can do tests that no one knows about, but you can still. That's your advice basically. Build a second life.
Yeah, that's more for the hostile environment. There's I started 20 years ago, right? Now there's a culture. So by today's standards, let me give a more updated version. So for it, first of all, it depends on your background, right? Because it's easier for me because I spent most of my career in this area, so I know the arguments and it's hard to pull the wool over my eyes, right? If I think someone's being unfair and manipulative, I'll see through it very quickly. But assuming everyone's sincere and straightforward, what the best thing to do is to, first of all, study your subject as seriously as possible to, obviously know your situations, because the last thing you want to do is to get into a conflict with someone where you get into an arguing spat. okay, my biggest advantage, and this is a very weird one, if it's something I think many people should aspire to. Yeah, I know, Guido, you have a really strong background in behavioral science, and you can probably do this. So, um, I often spot people's assumptions because I do a lot of training and I work with a lot of people hands-on. So I work with UX designers, graphic designers, like developers, and I know when they don't understand a key lesson in psychology, right? And I'm like, oh, this person didn't, they never learned Gestalt. Okay, I'll teach them. So they're arguing with me and they have a point of view because they don't, I know they don't understand basic Gestalt design principles, right? And so I could say, I think that this project, could benefit from Gestalt, and I'll try and educate them and show them. And then I'll sort of frame it saying, hey, maybe we could turn this into a learning experience. And then you could come back to me with your creative, but try and get these, proximity principles and a few other Gestalt principles in and see what does. And now instead of, this being a standoff, I'm helping someone with their career and their skills. So that's pretty much a win-win. Now in the future, I've addressed a problem. I'll often turn things into games like that. So also like a CRO person I'm with. Normally CRO people are good, but they tend to know the high level stuff, not the details. And I find most people, if it's a legitimate, if they legitimately don't agree because they don't know something, but there's like learning involved, they're often like for it. The other thing is turning testing into a game. I like to have fun, so you could see probably where I'm now and how I operate to do secret pilot testing. So I'll ask people what their theories are, and sometimes I'll even give them a few principles to play with and say, hey, how would you do the creative for this, right? So let's say we use a social norm and something called the efficacy message, so a confidence boosting message. We say, you know what, we think that we're missing a social norm and an efficacy message from this. Hey, does anyone have any good creative? And actually, I try not to come up with the creative. I just give them the strategies. And I find a lot of creative people, they love that. It's a bit like a game for them. They're learning. And then what happens is now your A/B testing is now like, hey, all right, let's crack it open and see who won or something. I don't know, put some money. Want to have fun. I've lost. Yeah. I have lost a CRO wars with one person once. It was a senior developer. He kicked my butt on a logo design concept. So, and then he's like gloating, loser. You're good. Other is also education and creating a culture. And then if you do things right, don't be that person who's in the room trying to stand up. Change your battlefield months in advance. That's probably the easiest way to do it. So,
yeah. But have you ever considered a career in games, in gaming?
No, I'm not a big game player. I have a colleague, Dr. Shadros, who's a gamification and education specialist. He plays like our World of Warcraft at night. I went cold turkey I think about the age of, I think I was 27, with StarCraft. I said, that was it. I will never play this again. This is crack. Right? I don't think it was crack at the time, but it was like horribly addictive. And that's it. So I've avoided games. So probably not my thing.
Will this work? Maybe not. Isn't that what we're all trying to figure out? With VWO, create and A/B test different variations of your website to continuously discover the best performing versions that improve conversions. Stop guessing. Start A/B testing with VWO today.
We just spoke about those principles, the cognitive biases, the enormous list that we can find on Wikipedia. Let's zoom in on that. What is this list, and what's, well, let's if you can tell us what's wrong with it. Let's back it up a bit. So what is a behavioral change principle to start with?
Yeah, so before I go out and it's like, why, or maybe why how will Brian rationalize trashing the orthodoxy here, right? 'Cause we're being a bit iconoclastic here because I'm about to tear down something that a lot of people hold to be true. So yeah, that's a wonderful question. So what's a behavioral change principle? And so it gets, it starts there. So a lot of people, like say we take that giant wheel that's been floating around with all these cognitive biases, right? And you pick one of them, like, or you take any of Cialdini's behavior change principles, right? Like, you can ask someone, well, why do you even believe that's true? Like, is it real? Is loss aversion real? Is it true that in all situations that humans fear loss more than they desire a gain? Is that been mathematically proven? Is the principle of reciprocity, is that always true or not true? And you could challenge these. Now the problem is that once you get into behavioral science, it's like entering a bureaucracy, and the rules get more and more and more dense, and then the distinctions get deeper and deeper, and you go from a taxonomy of 6 behavior change principles, and now you're at 200 behavior change principles. And when you get down to the 200 principles, it's like, oh, this principle is a combination of that, and it's like spun in this way, and so you start splitting hairs at some point. So where do these actual behavior change principles come from? And then let me answer that, and then we could go back to the giant shopping list that people throw around as almost like magic solutions for how to change behavior.
Yeah.
So and there's a little bit of politics in here as well. So maybe I could throw that in. So one of the requirements for getting a PhD, and one of the requirements for surviving something called publish or perish, is recognition. So you have to be recognized for your work. And so academics are under pressure to have a new discovery, right? So oh, I found a new behavior change principle. Oh, I found a new cognitive bias, right? I found this. No one knew about it, but I found it. So the easy pickings are gone. So like self-efficacy, self-efficacy was not in a number of early behavior change models, That was like later added. And I think Asian later added that when like his transition from theory of reason, action, and planned behavior was actually, it was a patch-up job, adding social norms, I believe it was social norms and self-efficacy, or I think, or maybe it was just self-efficacy that was added to the mix. But basically it was like, oh, crap, I forgot that principle, and it proved to be good. So a new principle had come out of nowhere. It was soon to be so highly correlated with behavioral outcomes that people are like, oh, crap, I got to add that in. My model sucks. And I add that in, and now we get better predictive patterns on the effectiveness of our model. So there's this competition, and there's new principles and stuff. So the principles have come from old, the original old principles you'll find in the work of Aristotle that are actually quite popular in the old works of rhetoric, or persuasion principles, and actually many of the cognitive biases you'll find in the ancient Greek writings on the informal fallacies. So these are irrational argumentation tactics that are they're cognitive biases. So that means they're ways of getting someone to change through an intellectual type of misunderstanding, as opposed to, say, a social normative way of getting someone to change, which will be through a social emotional pressure, versus another type of mechanism that drives a behavior change principle. So scientists have to come up with these psychological models. Now, most of the behavior change principles are psychological based, and so maybe I could do something that Jordan Peterson did, if this is okay. Explains factor analysis, if this is not too much. So it's like, how do psychologists actually distill what an actual behavior change principle is? Because not a lot of people even know where it comes from. So let me explain one thing technical, because I could call anything a behavior change principle, right? Anything I like, right? I could say, I don't know, making someone stare at you for 5 seconds causes them to like you. Or if I touch someone, it will cause them to trust me a little bit more, right? I could say anything I like, but now I got to measure that. So a lot of the behavior change principles we know come from psychological models, where behavioral scientists might make a survey question, and they will come up with different things that they call a construct. So say a social norm, which is a popular one we all know, and trust in the source of a message might be another principle. And that we could name anyone. And anticipation of the outcome could be yet the third. We could just start inventing these. So I could build a statistical model and then run it through something called factor analysis, and then correlate that to whether people did the behavior or not. And then based on that, I'll start figuring out, are some of these principles correlated with behavioral outcomes, or are they just different ways of saying the exact same thing? Because what factor analysis does that's brilliant is it clusters similar things together. So what factor analysis does is it lets us cut through the nonsense. So there are behavioral economics researchers who have gone through and said, look, these shopping lists of 100 principles is complete and utter nonsense. They did factor analysis. You know what their principle lists come out to? It's like 8.
Cialdini will like that.
Yeah.
just 8. You can write another book. He got to 6 plus 1. Yeah. So that's basically Cialdini's next book.
Yeah, and it also depends on how well you frame them. So if you frame the principles as broad things, factor analysis will pull all the sub techniques into each other. So yeah, so you'll have the sub principles and the hair splitting tactics, and you need to know those, right? That's just part of getting better in applied behavioral science. But the factor also show, they're just a variation of the same old thing. And 8 is not the actual number. I have to go back and look at the actual number from the paper, but I think it was somewhere in that number. Also, behavioral scientists in the UK, they reduced, I think, about 120 behavioral science principles, and this was through consensus, to around 20. And I think if we did factor analysis, it probably would have gone down even more.
That sounds much more manageable.
Yeah.
But also, don't you think it's also because of the people that then see those principles, they assume, okay, this is what works, and it works all the time. You said okay, this is a principle. I found this. This is gonna work everywhere, and then we can apply it everywhere. But that's also an assumption that the person makes that is reading that. That's not often necessarily what the researcher intended, right? They just did a research, and usually, and from reading all those research papers, my experience is that A worked slightly better than B, but never always or everywhere. Or that's usually not what the researcher's intention is. But that's how it's popularized and then gets into a list.
Yeah, that's part of the absurd distortion that happens when knowledge goes from the scientific community into industry. And between that are the gurus who distort. Like, that's where BJ Fogg, his work ultimately he finally published. And actually, I saw he just got listed. He's like New York Times bestseller, and I think like Amazon, he's doing very well. But his work turned into something called Tiny Habits, about very small changes. But look how BJ Fogg's work got spun into absurd conspiracy theories called Hooked. Like, you can addict people. It's like the actual academic called it Tiny Habits, not Hooked, not addicted. It's so insane. And in my doctorate, I spent 2 years looking at all the meta-analyses and the big reviews of these behavior change principles, and behaviorism was so low on the list. It's a requirement as a minimum for communications, but its effects are very small. And so Tiny Habits got spun into getting people hooked and addicted, and then people believe this, and now a very small principle that came from a small area of research is something like you said, people now start applying it to everything as if it's going to have stellar effects across the board wherever you go. And that is utter insanity.
Yesterday's brainstorm was so good. I really liked Steph's idea of running that test on the call to action buttons. Making them orange will really make them stand out, don't you think?
Yeah, right. Do you want to design real A/B test winners and achieve enormous conversion uplift? Then stop brainstorming and take a scientific approach. If you can read Dutch, follow the steps in Online Invloed, the bestseller on managementbook.nl. Or enroll in the author's course and become an expert in applying proven behavioral science yourself. Go to onlineinfluence.com for more information and free downloads. Those 8 or those 20 that they boiled everything down to, these still have their, they apply in certain situations and not everywhere, right? They're still not universal, apply them everywhere principles.
Yeah, most of the behavioral science principles are context dependent, and what people also don't know is that when you actually, well, you'll know this by a lot of people who are more lay and practitioner level in the use of these principles. They don't know is that in every scientific paper, there's something called the limitation section, and the limitation section actually says how generalizable that knowledge is. And what academics do is they limit the heck out of almost everything they write. They'll say that, this nudge strategy worked with middle-aged women in suburban Nebraska in December of this year, right? And it's like, that's the population. And now you're like, you're going to get everyone hooked or something, right? And the distortions are incredible. So, but there are some principles that are more universal that do work time and time again. And the broad frameworks tend to latch in onto those very broad principles. And I think those you'll mainly find explained by our cognitive processes and our emotional systems. And some very, very sort of raw underlaying factors that drive human behavior. And those tend to be a bit more generalizable. But yeah, a lot of the principles get spun to the point of absurdity, and I have to deal with that in my training. I have to do a lot of debunking, and it's like, I think the impact is the other area of distortion. So not only is it generalizable to all humans, right? But so a lot of these papers will say this only impacted, this had like about, normally it's not published as a percentage, but let's just call it a percentage because that's what many people understand, right? So let's say this improved outcomes by 10% or something, right? Once people figure out the principle that improved outcomes by 10%, once the gurus misinterpret the science and start misleading the public, what they're going to do is going to treat it as like 100%. It's like, it works all the time. It's like, what? I see that constantly, and then something that was like a marginal improvement is now like a massive like transformative strategy. And you're just like, where did that come from? So so there, it's not just there's a lot of distortion. It's not just the generalizability problem.
Yeah, I think that's a problem a lot of CRO people encounter when they start their career or start at a new job, and if the CRO role at the companies is fairly new, then a lot of people, the people that hired you or the team you come in, they have those assumptions, right? They're at the beginning at the Dunning-Kruger chart, where they may have heard some of those principles and assume that these are all true. And that's something you need to an internal battle that you might encounter, saying, okay, but it actually doesn't work like that, unfortunately. There are a lot of ways it doesn't work. We don't know if it's going to work on our side, and we need to do a lot of research and validation to figure it out what actually works, what works for us or not.
Yeah, that's like a very good point. Like, if you're more deep into like applying psychology and some of your colleagues are on board, sometimes a little bit of knowledge is a bad thing, but I think normally most people, it's not a problem at all, and it's in fact a good thing, because what you can often do is say, okay, let's go with the social norm, right? Actually, I don't like using the word social proof, and that's fine, you can use it. It's just, I'll call it a social norm, because I actually did a study where we split different types of social influence have been proven to impact behavior. And we actually we actually couldn't find social proof as a distinct principle separate from a social norm. Right? I did a statistical study and we published this in the Lit. But so in fact, social proof or social norms will have many subcomponents. So underneath a social norm could be something called social facilitation, where you're letting people feel they're being watched by other people. You can have social learning principles, where you're educating people by having them watch other people do things. There's obviously the social norm itself. And also within social norms, there's multiple subcategories of how you would implement the norm. And that's where the hair splitting goes, because you need to understand those. So what I sometimes would do with people is I say, okay, let's go with the social norm. Do we want to do it like this or that style? Does anyone want to do some research on different ways of implementing it? Because people might not know the names for all the different types of social psych principles and social influence principles, but as they play with different tactics that work, they'll actually be playing on sometimes very different principles of social influence, thinking that they're implementing a social norm or social proof, but they're actually implementing a completely different social psychological principle. And I'm okay, because you can do well with tactics. Just as long as they're open and they're testing, I figure that the testing will point you in the right direction. Your users will pretty much tell you. So, I will get blue in my face, like, oh, that's, you're using this principle, not that. And so I can let it go. And then in the worst case scenario, sometimes for diplomatic reasons, I will accept something that I'm really against. And I'll say, if you're really morally against it, sometimes you have to say, I'm against this. I'm not accountable. If you want to go forward, I'll give you all the glory. That's like really bad. That's a total conflict, and it very rarely happens. A few times in my career it's come to that, but normally it's like, okay, let's just test it, and maybe I'm wrong as well, because I'm a big, I'm an established expert in my area, but I make mistakes all the time, and like the users are the ultimate judge, so I'll let them overrule my judgment any day.
So when do you know when you're applying, if you're applying the right principle, and if you're applying the right strategy for the challenges?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe I could talk about a collaboration I did with a good friend of mine, Michael Agard, who's he's a fairly prominent conversion optimization specialist. He's a huge Daniel Kahneman fan, and we met like many years ago, and we've been good friends ever since. Actually, I have to say.
And you built a course together, right?
Yeah, we did a course in Conversion XL together. We had talked about doing a course, and then Pep approached me, and then I wrote to Mike and said, "Hey, remember we said do a course? Do you want to collaborate?" And so we did a great course. But and maybe one last thing, I knew we were destined to be good friends, because he had a tattoo on his arm that said "Hey ho." I think it's "Hey ho, let's go." And I body surfed to the Ramones when I was younger, so we're on good footing.
Yeah, so you guys work together on a course for CXL. You more from the theoretical background, and Michael more from the practical. Let's run a lot of tests background, right?
Yes, and that's exactly it. So I wanted to I'll tell you this story, because there's two ways of approaching it. So how do you know what is the right principle for the job? So what's awesome about Michael is, he spent 10 years split testing before he got into psychology at all. Everything he knew it's amazing. It's from brute force. And Michael is it's uncanny how he has such a natural sense for what works, right? And he's got hyper tactical knowledge. And he told me, like, at one point, he's like, I just know you'd have to put all these trust things next to the button. I don't know why. And, I know that you have to color it like this, right? And he has like this incredible tactical knowledge. So he could tell you where you put every UI element on the page to get better conversion. And after 10 years of split testing, he got incredibly good at that. Now, I came at things a little differently. Um, I started hands-on, so I was building, and I always worked in measurement, but I was not an early adopter of A/B testing tools. I think I started on those a few years in. Um, after they were exploding, right? So even before people used the word CRO, I think, or I was there just when it was taking off. But the true CRO experts, I don't even think CRO is not really a thing for many years, just like UX wasn't even a thing, interactive design wasn't a thing, digital, like all the professions we were using for well over a decade before they even had formal names. So
I mean, CRO is also basically doing user research, using qualitative and quantitative data, combining that and doing validation. So in that sense, it existed for a very long time, but somehow CRO is very much linked to doing it on a website, of course. But I mean, those principles are not new.
Yeah, they've been around for so long. Um, and so Michael went at it tactically. And me, I went through, I always did a lot of measurement and hands-on work, but I went deep into it. I did like a PhD, and in my PhD, I was analyzing, the principles that are used in behavior change taxonomies and used in technology. So after several years, I could look at any page and tell you the main principles that are being applied, and I could generally guess how well a product was doing. And this is way before anyone was doing any work in psychology. So when I started, most people thought I was insane for looking at psychology on the web. So, who would do that? Right? That's stupid. But so I had this incredible knowledge. I spent years analyzing the psychological principles. I published in the scientific literature and like some prominent health behavior change journals, did a full statistical meta-analysis. It was like pretty solid on full tactical analysis. So I could look at something and approach it from a theoretical and framework perspective. Michael could approach it from a tactical perspective. But, we're not that radical, because obviously I do a lot of measurement, and I also would know things based on, what works in practical applications and seeing impact metrics. So it's not like I'm a pure ivory tower academic. And Michael got into psychology later on, and he started, consuming everything with an incredible appetite. And he became a very deep expert into Daniel Kahneman's approach and concepts from behavioral economics, which I could say Michael probably knows behavioral economics principles deeper than anyone I know. So we both came at it, but we have these strengths, and I think we recognize them. We're also musicians, so we never did a gig together, but I think we probably perform well on stage. So there's two ways to approach it. What is the right principle for a job? So this comes down to something called fit, and you might know it from having a lot of tactical knowledge. So that tactical knowledge, if you've worked in an industry or in an area and you've been working with clients and customers for many years, you'll tend to know what works just from brute force, trial and error. You'll eventually figure it out. Basically, you succeed or you fail. And if you're still standing, you're doing something right. So you figured it out through brute force, and you know what works. Now, the problem with that knowledge is it normally doesn't translate well. So you can't go to a neighboring application. So say someone who's optimizing insurance landing pages, can they now go to a nonprofit and optimize a donation page? Right? Probably not. Or, a lot of things will carry over, but there's a lot of tactical things that won't work. And now let's look at things from a purely theoretical perspective. So I have these very broad frameworks, and I could look at almost anything in any industry, and I could pretty much guess, okay, they're using this, I see how they're tied up. I could go into the industry and I could see, okay, most people in this industry are making this and that. I could rattle off almost instantly all the general principles, and I could reverse engineer the psychological strategies used by entire industries insanely fast, because that's what I specialize in. That's just my shtick. I spent a lot of time doing it. And so between the two, you can sort of get a sense of what works, right? And figuring out what is the right principle for any challenge and context is something you would call fit. So what's the right fitting principle? And you build that up through years of experience. So unfortunately, there is not an off-the-shelf answer to that. So years of experience will help you to understand that. Stopping with the mindless application of behavioral science principles is a good way to get better at it, and going with what is the behavioral science framework that's most appropriate to my area of work. Now, that means you have to get into theory, and a lot of people don't like that. They love their magic shopping list of the 10 psychological principles that will hook your users, right? And all that nonsense there. So it will require an investment, and I try and help my students. I give them the frameworks and I help them create the judgment. Some people don't want that. I know they want the magic solution that works 100% in all situations for all humans. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. I don't. If you could give it to me, I'll take it. So it comes down to like playing with the models. Reverse engineering in industry is a good start. So you could use some sneaky tools, use some spy technology. So I don't know, use like SpyFu or SEMrush. Try and figure out who's spending money and where the competition is, and where there's landing pages. You might not know the conversion metrics, right? You could use some scouting tools. Try and find the landing pages in the industry where you know there's something going on. You know that the needle is tipping and that there's something in there. You do a review of those. Don't steal a single idea, because that's theft. But figure out the principles and then go back to the drawing board and use that to do things in a way based on your own user research. But never, ever copy principles verbatim, because what works in one context can fail in another. So it's insanely dangerous. And my also advice is never steal tactics, because tactics are very dangerous. Like I see
I mean, when I worked on the agency side, when something worked at one client, we often tried copying that over to other clients. It usually didn't work well.
Yeah, you can get backfires very easily from that.
Yeah. Hey, so when you teach, obviously, so when you get a fresh batch of students, what are the most common, I guess, misconceptions, or the most prevalent misconceptions that you that you need to start debunking right away?
Oh yeah, there's a few. So one thing I now do more and more of is, like, I tell people, look, applied behavioral science is a research-heavy process, right? So that means, there's a lot to learn, and we're going to implement it in a very user-centered and user-driven approach. So I try and back up. Every guru and expert will tell you, satisfy your users. And I'm no different. Like, it's standard. So I try and set the expectation that, look, I'm not going to give you a magic set of principles that work in all cases. Another misconception is that there are these magic shopping lists of what works in all cases for all people. And it's like, so I try and set the expectation that it requires a bit more of a flexible approach and requires you to shop around. One thing that I deal with, so I train everyone from people who are absolute beginners to world elite designers, and also I train a lot of behavioral science and behavioral science teams, just because for a behavioral science team, I'll be teaching my peers, but they recognize I'm their peer who specialized in digital, and so I have a very deep knowledge only in my niche. And I'll even tell some of the more experienced people, I said, I'm going to tell you a lot of things you already know, but I'm just going to show you how they apply, in a medium that you haven't worked in. And that's important, because there's no guarantee. So one is that setting that expectation that you're going to have to put in some effort to learn things. And there's maybe... and actually, there's one maybe other thing, and it's something that's sort of changed in me quite a lot, and that's we're talking about behavior change principles. So, I ended up segmenting my course into behavioral science and neuroscience. I call my second course emotional design, but it's neuroscience, because the science of emotions is neuroscience. Right? Neuroscience gives us more understanding of emotions than psychology does. And I know that might sound funny to people, but neuroscience is where you actually chop open the nervous system and you take a look at what's going on a bit more literally. And so we have a better understanding of emotion. So it's like,
don't do this at home, by the way.
yes.
Don't chop up your nervous system. Don't do that.
And if you have neurotech, like here I have my visual cortex EEG reader and other things, but otherwise don't chop open your brain and measure your emotions.
No.
Actually, I guess taking your pulse is an easy way to do it. But the other thing is to set the expectations that emotion-based design and more and applied psychology or behavioral science is more dogmatic. So I try to tell people it's actually behavioral science is really easy. It's more like just learning a bunch of principles that fit into these models and then shopping around for the best fitting one. And then it's actually a fun and creative act. And that's the other thing, because I did improv for a little bit of time. And so people don't realize how fun it is to apply behavioral science. And I train earlier I mentioned I train people from beginners to like elite designers. I also train public health officials and prominent behavioral scientists in public health, and they're shell-shocked. These people have been wounded by very stiff 500-page behavior change books. And I show them how to pick the principles and models. But then what I do next is the crazy thing most people don't even know about. We play a game of improv at that point, and we have fun, and we do a creative process. And that the science and creativity go so well together. And I don't just say this dogmatically. People crack up laughing in my class. We have so much fun. These are the best moments. When we do that handover from the hard analysis and research, and then we're getting creative, if you do it right, it's awesome. So that's maybe the last expectation that has to be cracked. It's not stiff, it's fun.
Definitely something that CROs can copy, I think. Set the expectations right when you start and have fun.
Yes.
Let's do that. Brian, final question for you. When you look at, when you look at CRO, the profession, the people working in that, compared with what you do, what's the insight that you have that you think that CROs haven't caught up on yet? What should they invest more time in?
The heart of everything I do, and it just keeps going more and more and more, is going back to actually one of Aristotle's principles. And, the whole concept of humans are driven by their intellect, emotion, and lizard brain. So there's something more to that. So that's actually that's similar to Aristotle's concept, that you appeal to the intellect, to the emotions, but then it's the credibility of the speaker. And so I think forming trust with the brand is important. So what a lot of people don't know is that humans interact with brands similar to how they interact with other humans. And I know that might sound insane. There are now studies that show you can manipulate brand, an interpretation of a brand and your emotional connection to a brand with a couple of spritzers of oxytocin spray up the nose. And that social cognition, which is manipulated through a couple of oxytocin spritzes, also impacts on user-brand relationships. So in that, having an emotional connection with an authentic, credible source behind the message is the main thing. So it's like authenticity. And I can't give any more advice on how to establish credibility than this. Be credible. Know your stuff and act in the interest of people, and be authentic. And I believe that will carry through. And the rest, we're just thrown on top of that. And here's the other thing. From all the studies I do, if you violate that credibility, this is what happens. You can do your own testing. I see it every time I test this. A well-designed website that fails the credibility and trust test can instantly evoke fear and anxiety and distrust. That is like fatal flaw. So be authentic is the main thing.
Be authentic.
Yes.
Nice. Brian, thank you so much for your time and sharing all of this with us. What are you working on the next, this year, 2021?
Yeah, so I'm actually in a retreat mode. So while COVID is still going on, I set myself a bunch of goals. So I pursue too many things at once. So I have a line. So first I'm cleaning up my school. So I've been working hands-on, implementing funnels. I decided I'm going to rebuild it all myself. I have contractors that work with me and it's a mess. So the only way, got to bite the bullet. And then I improve all of my technical skills. So that keeps me current. So I'm on that. I'm now finally writing a book on everything. So my entire training system, I'm putting into a book.
A book on everything.
On everything. Yeah. I feel I just want to get it out of the way. And then actually, I'll tell you, and then next, I have a whole personality system, which I use as the basis for making predictions on principles to use with different people. So it's a personality system designed to measure people's neurotransmitters and hormone levels, and then to correlate with the taxonomy of behavior change that I use. And I'm using that for AI technology. And if that's not enough, I started teaching myself C++. I put this one down. It's what I'm really passionate about. What I really want to do, I don't think I'll have any time for this, but I'm very interested in mind-linked neurotech and how we design for human conscious perception of spatial relationships and sound and tactile experience. So going into the user experience, but in a way where I can transmit my experiences to another person. So I'm so interested in brain-linked technology, which is why I happen to have a visual cortex reader. And this is just part of it. I have a whole suite. I put it down like, Brian, stop this. You're insane. You're too distracted. Focus. So that's what I'm passionate about. But like video games, I'll get off that dopamine kick for now.
Yeah. So let me know when the book is done. Then we can do a podcast on that, and after that we can do another podcast on the Neuralink. Let's do that. Brian, final question. Who should I ask to come on the podcast?
Oh, yeah. So I listed a couple of friends who I know are good in the people. So my friend Agnes, who I did some studies with, he's a good person to speak with, and he's now a professor in Paris. He did his doctoral research on social psych, and I did a study with him. So he's good to speak with if, say, you want to go to the nuance of just social psychology. And how it operates in technical environments. And he could give you a ton of examples on the, like, basically, if you want to say, okay, social proof is a broad concept, but if you want to go a level down into all the social influence that is correlated with it, right? It's going to be social norms, but here are all the other highly correlated social psych principles. So we go to that. One other person, David Chandros, is a friend and a professor in gamification and education. So he could talk about gamification designs, but for engagement, his stuff, I mean, a lot of his stuff, you could probably talk about LMSs. It might be a bit outside of conversion design. And, Agnes's work is going to be a bit more of this also social change, right? So when you get to the academics, they tend to get a bit off page and more into the broader campaign. So those are two.
Yeah, but like I said, it makes sense to have a theoretical understanding of what you're dealing with, and get a sense of where are these theories actually coming from, how and to be critical about them. Yeah, Brian, thank you so much. We're way past our time. Thank you so much for educating us and sharing all your experience with us, and definitely looking forward to that book. And like I said, let me know when it comes out, then we can promote it under our audience.
For sure, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. Have a great day. Bye bye.
Bye now.
And this concludes Season 3, Episode 4 of the Shiro Cafe podcast with Brian Kugelman. Make sure to check out the show notes on the Shiro Cafe website. For the next episode, we will apply this science update in practice when we switch to the merchant side, when we talk with Abby Schoenberg, Director of Marketing at Fancy.com.